In the vast expanse of West Africa's Sahel region, a crisis is quietly intensifying in the skies above nations grappling with their own futures. This is a story about sovereignty, suspicion, and the dangerous collision between regional power dynamics and global military interests. It's a narrative that rarely makes international headlines, yet it carries profound implications for the stability of an already volatile region. What we are examining here is not a straightforward conflict between clearly defined enemies, but rather a complex web of territorial disputes, strategic interests, and deeply rooted mistrust that threatens to fundamentally reshape the geopolitical landscape of West Africa. The Sahel, that vast semi-arid zone stretching across the African continent, has long been a region of competing interests. In recent years, three nations have begun moving closer together in their political and security arrangements: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Together, they formed what's known as the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. This alliance represents a significant shift in regional dynamics, one that has seen these nations increasingly distance themselves from Western military partnerships and forge stronger ties with alternative powers, particularly Russia. Within this shifting landscape, a particular friction point has emerged involving military operations based in Nigeria, a country that sits strategically on the coast and maintains significant military partnerships with Western powers, including the United States. The United States maintains a military presence in Nigeria, officially justified by the ongoing threat posed by terrorist organizations. Specifically, the US acknowledges deploying approximately 200 to 250 military personnel to Nigeria, accompanied by surveillance aircraft and reconnaissance drones. According to official statements from both the American and Nigerian governments, this deployment exists solely to combat extremist groups, primarily Boko Haram and the Islamic State's West Africa province, known as ISWAP. These organizations have indeed perpetrated numerous attacks across the region, causing significant loss of life and displacement. The counterterrorism mission, on the surface, appears to be a logical response to a genuine security threat. However, the narrative being advanced by Sahelian authorities presents a markedly different interpretation of these military activities. According to this perspective, the primary purpose of the US military presence in Nigeria is not straightforward counterterrorism, but rather intelligence gathering and surveillance directed at the Alliance of Sahel States itself. This claim rests on a particular suspicion that advanced surveillance equipment is being deployed to monitor the military movements and activities of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rather than solely focusing on terrorist organizations. From the viewpoint of these Sahelian nations, the positioning of these forces near their borders represents an intrusion into their sovereignty and an attempt to gather intelligence about their internal military capabilities and strategic decisions. This interpretation is not without context. The Alliance of Sahel States has made decisions that have deeply concerned Western powers, most notably welcoming Russian military support and private security contractors, particularly the Wagner Group, into their territories. From a Western strategic perspective, this represents a concerning shift in global alignments. From the perspective of the Sahel states, however, they view themselves as exercising their sovereign right to choose their partners and seek security assistance wherever they believe it most effective. The tension between these two worldviews has created a dangerous dynamic where each side suspects the other of deceptive intentions. The specific incidents fueling this crisis began with what authorities in Burkina Faso characterize as repeated violations of their airspace by military aircraft without prior authorization. According to the account we are examining, Nigeria has been warned multiple times about allowing US military aircraft to operate near the borders of Sahelian nations without proper notification and permission. These warnings were reportedly issued diplomatically, through official channels, requesting that Nigeria reposition these foreign military forces away from sensitive border regions. However, according to this narrative, Nigeria has consistently ignored these warnings, allowing the airspace violations to continue. One incident that lends credibility to Sahelian concerns occurred when a Nigerian military aircraft entered Burkina Faso's airspace without authorization and was subsequently intercepted and seized by Burkinabe forces. This event forced Nigeria into a diplomatic apology, acknowledging the incursion. However, rather than resolving the underlying tensions, this incident appears to have served as a warning that Sahelian nations were serious about enforcing their airspace boundaries. It also demonstrated the resolve of these nations to take concrete action rather than merely issue warnings. Now, according to the narrative, the situation has escalated significantly. The Alliance of Sahel States is reportedly preparing what they characterize as a final warning to Nigeria. Any unauthorized aircraft entering their airspace will henceforth be treated as a hostile act. More dramatically, the account suggests that Sahelian authorities have indicated such aircraft could be shot down. This represents a profound escalation from diplomatic protest to a military threat. The language employed, calling unauthorized incursions a hostile act subject to armed response, transforms this from a sovereignty dispute into something approaching a potential military confrontation. The military posture described in this narrative suggests serious preparation for such confrontation. According to the account, the Alliance of Sahel States has reportedly deployed air defense systems along their borders and issued strict orders to military personnel to respond immediately to any airspace violations. This indicates not merely rhetorical positioning but actual military preparation for armed response. Such deployments require resources, coordination, and authorization at the highest levels of government. The fact that these preparations are reportedly underway suggests that Sahelian leadership has made a strategic decision to place enforcement of their airspace boundaries on a par with national security imperatives. The broader context for understanding this crisis involves the changing alignments in West African geopolitics. For decades, many African nations maintained close security partnerships with Western powers, particularly France and the United States. However, in recent years, a countertrend has emerged. Multiple countries across the Sahel region have experienced military coups, resulting in governments increasingly skeptical of Western intentions. These new governments have questioned the effectiveness of Western counterterrorism strategies and grown suspicious of Western military bases on their territory. They've increasingly turned toward Russia as an alternative security partner. Mali expelled French forces from its territory. Burkina Faso has similarly moved away from French military partnerships. Niger, after initially hosting substantial American military presence, has also begun restricting Western operations. Within this shifting landscape, the suspicions harbored by Sahelian authorities about the true purpose of US military operations in Nigeria become more comprehensible. These nations view their region through the lens of historical colonial exploitation and contemporary concerns about neo-imperialism. They interpret foreign military deployments near their borders not simply as counterterrorism operations but as extensions of great power competition for regional influence. Whether or not the US military presence in Nigeria is actually conducting surveillance targeting the AES, the perception that it might be represents a significant geopolitical problem in itself. It's important to acknowledge that claims made by any party in such disputes merit careful scrutiny. The narrative we are examining presents the Sahelian perspective, but it's worth considering alternative interpretations. The United States and Nigeria would argue that their military cooperation exists solely to address the genuine threat posed by terrorist organizations. They might note that ISWAP and Boko Haram have perpetrated horrific attacks that have killed tens of thousands and displaced millions. From this perspective, the Sahelian suspicions appear to reflect an unfounded paranoia that obscures the legitimate security rationale for the military presence. Furthermore, some analysts argue that distancing from Western counterterrorism partnerships in favor of Russian support represents a poor strategic choice for nations facing genuine extremist threats. However, the pattern of repeated airspace violations, as described in this narrative, does suggest that Nigerian and American forces have been operating in a manner that shows insufficient respect for the borders and sovereignty of neighboring nations. Whether deliberate or the result of poor coordination, such violations validate Sahelian complaints about lack of respect for their territorial integrity. The incident in which a Nigerian aircraft was seized after violating Burkinabe airspace provides concrete evidence that these violations are not merely alleged but have actually occurred. The potential consequences of continued escalation cannot be overstated. If Sahelian air defense systems were actually to shoot down a US military aircraft, the ramifications would extend far beyond the immediate incident. Such an action would represent a dramatic confrontation between the United States and a coalition of West African nations. It could trigger international diplomatic crises, military retaliation, and a fundamental realignment of security relationships across the region. Even if such an extreme scenario does not materialize, continued tensions could further destabilize an already precarious security situation. The Sahel region faces numerous challenges. Extremist groups continue to expand their operations, humanitarian crises deepen, and millions of civilians live in areas where state authority is weak or absent. Escalating tensions between legitimate governments, even when rooted in legitimate sovereignty concerns, can only make these broader challenges worse. The timing of this crisis is particularly significant. The international system is currently experiencing broader great power competition, particularly between the United States and Russia. West African nations find themselves in the position of having to choose sides or navigate a careful middle path. Russia has successfully positioned itself as an alternative to Western military partnerships, particularly after the withdrawal of many Western nations from Mali and the reduced American footprint in Niger. The Wagner Group's presence in multiple Sahelian states, despite its controversial reputation and mixed results in counterterrorism operations, demonstrates that these nations are willing to accept less traditional partnerships if they believe those partnerships better serve their interests. This context helps explain why Sahelian nations react so strongly to perceived violations of their airspace by aircraft associated with Western powers. For these nations, enforcing their airspace boundary represents a symbolic assertion of sovereignty and a refusal to be treated as subordinate to external powers. It's a way of saying that they, not outside powers, determine the rules that govern their own territory. This is not merely technical sovereignty but something deeper, a statement about who has the right to make decisions about their own security and future. The role of Nigeria in this drama deserves particular attention. Nigeria is West Africa's largest economy and most populous nation. It's not simply a host nation for US military operations but an active participant in the geopolitical dynamics of the region. Nigeria has its own complicated relationship with the nations of the AES. Historically, Nigeria has seen itself as a regional power with responsibilities extending across the Sahel. However, Nigeria itself faces significant terrorist threats from Boko Haram and ISWAP, primarily in its northeastern regions. These groups have conducted attacks that have killed tens of thousands and displaced millions within Nigeria itself. From Nigeria's perspective, maintaining close cooperation with American counterterrorism efforts represents a rational response to a genuine and persistent threat. Yet Nigeria's apparent lack of responsiveness to the diplomatic warnings from the AES suggests that Lagos has chosen to prioritize its partnership with the United States over accommodation of its neighbors' sovereignty concerns. Whether this reflects a calculation that American military support is more valuable than regional solidarity, or whether it represents a failure of diplomatic communication, the result is the same: escalating tensions with neighbors who are growing increasingly assertive about protecting their territorial integrity. Nigeria finds itself in a difficult position, wedged between Western partnership and regional friction. The question of what happens next remains genuinely uncertain. There are several possible trajectories. One scenario involves continued escalation, with more airspace violations leading to more aggressive warnings and ultimately to military confrontation. Another involves a diplomatic resolution, where Nigeria and the United States agree to more carefully coordinate their operations to avoid violating the airspace of neighboring nations, perhaps by routing flights through different corridors or obtaining explicit advance permission. A third scenario involves what might be called strategic ambiguity, where both sides maintain their positions and prepare for conflict but attempt to avoid actually triggering it through careful management of incidents. The involvement of international actors complicates matters further. The African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and other regional organizations could potentially play mediating roles, though their effectiveness remains uncertain. Major powers like France, which maintain significant interests in West Africa, might seek to influence outcomes. Russia could potentially leverage this crisis to further expand its influence in the region, positioning itself as an alternative to American partnerships. China, which has significant economic investments across the region, would likely prefer stability to escalation. The human cost of continued instability cannot be ignored. The Sahel region is already experiencing one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Millions of people have been displaced by conflict. Food insecurity affects tens of millions. Healthcare and education systems have collapsed in many areas. The security situation impacts civilians far more severely than it impacts military forces. Any escalation of tensions, any diversion of resources from addressing humanitarian needs to military preparation, represents a tragedy for ordinary people living in the region. It's also worth considering the effectiveness of military approaches to counterterrorism in the Sahel. Despite years of military operations by various powers, terrorist organizations continue to expand their territorial control and operational capabilities. This raises questions about whether military solutions alone are adequate, or whether broader approaches involving development, governance improvements, and addressing the underlying grievances that fuel extremism might be necessary. However, such broader approaches take time and require sustained commitment, whereas military operations produce more immediate, if often temporary, results. The narrative we've examined presents a dramatic story of escalating tensions, military preparations, and potential confrontation. However, it's important to recognize that this narrative, like all narratives emerging from geopolitical disputes, reflects a particular perspective. The Sahelian perspective presented here emphasizes Western violations of sovereignty and the right of nations to defend their borders. An alternative narrative, emphasizing counterterrorism imperatives and the strategic importance of preventing terrorist sanctuaries, would present the situation quite differently. The truth likely lies in acknowledging that both perspectives contain elements of validity, while both contain elements of exaggeration or distortion. What remains clear is that West Africa stands at a geopolitical inflection point. The days when Western nations could operate relatively freely in the region with minimal challenge are ending. New powers are asserting themselves. Traditional partnerships are being questioned. Alignment patterns are shifting. Within this larger transformation, the specific crisis involving airspace violations and military posturing represents both a symptom of broader changes and a potential catalyst for dramatic new developments. The international community should recognize that this situation, while not yet a shooting conflict, represents a genuine crisis requiring serious diplomatic attention. It would be tragic if escalating tensions between nations that face common challenges from terrorist organizations led to military conflict that further destabilized an already fragile region. The stakes extend beyond the immediate parties involved. A confrontation in West African airspace could trigger cascading consequences across the region and beyond, affecting global oil prices, migration patterns, terrorist recruitment, and humanitarian crises. The military preparations being reportedly undertaken by the Alliance of Sahel States should be taken seriously, not dismissed as empty posturing. These nations have demonstrated their willingness to take concrete action, as evidenced by the seizure of the Nigerian aircraft. The positioning of air defense systems and issuance of orders to military personnel to respond to incursions represent tangible preparations that suggest serious intent. At the same time, one must recognize that military brinkmanship, once initiated, can develop its own momentum. Incidents that seemed controllable can escalate beyond anyone's intention. Miscalculations can occur. The risk of actual armed conflict, while not imminent, is real and should not be minimized. For Nigeria, the path forward requires careful navigation. Lagos must balance its legitimate security cooperation with the United States against its relationship with regional neighbors. This might involve negotiating agreements with the US about operational procedures that avoid airspace violations. It might involve diplomatic outreach to the AES to explain the rationale for American operations and to seek understanding. It might involve proposing joint mechanisms for coordination and notification that could reduce suspicion and misunderstanding. The goal should be demonstrating that counterterrorism cooperation with the West and respect for regional sovereignty are not mutually exclusive. For the United States, the strategic challenge involves recognizing that operating through Nigerian territory while violating the airspace of neighboring nations creates more problems than it solves. Even if the military justification for operations is sound, the political and strategic costs of continued violations appear to be rising. Adjusting operational procedures to scrupulously respect the airspace of neighboring nations might require some increased complexity or cost, but these appear preferable to the risk of military confrontation or the permanent damage to relationships with countries that the US might otherwise hope to cooperate with. For the Alliance of Sahel States, the challenge involves distinguishing between legitimate concerns about sovereignty and an approach that could be perceived as unnecessarily aggressive or hostile to legitimate counterterrorism efforts. While the demand for respect of airspace is entirely justified, the threat to shoot down aircraft could be seen as an escalation that closes off diplomatic solutions. A measured approach that combines firm assertion of sovereignty with openness to negotiated solutions would likely serve these nations' long-term interests better than an intransigent stance. As this crisis unfolds in the coming weeks and months, the international community should watch carefully and consider what role it might play in encouraging peaceful resolution. The stakes are high not just for the nations immediately involved, but for the entire West African region and potentially for global geopolitical stability. This is a moment where diplomatic wisdom could prevent tragedy, or where miscalculation could trigger a confrontation that transforms the region's security landscape in ways that none of the parties involved might desire. The skies over West Africa have become a contested space where competing interests, legitimate sovereignty concerns, strategic partnerships, and great power competition intersect. What happens next will depend on the decisions made by leaders in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, the United States, and other nations with interests in the region. Whether this escalating crisis becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of geopolitical brinkmanship or a catalyst for new approaches to regional cooperation remains, for now, an open question. What is certain is that the current trajectory is unsustainable, and that some form of resolution or confrontation appears inevitable in the near term. The shape that resolution or confrontation takes will have profound implications not just for West Africa but for the broader evolution of global geopolitical alignments in an era of great power competition.